Hello, my name is Ian St John, and it gives me much pleasure to welcome you to this latest in my series of St John's Pipecasts. Our topic today is Arthur Lewis's model of economic development with unlimited supplies of labour. Now, Arthur Lewis's 1954 article, Economic Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labour, is often considered to be the single most influential contribution to the establishment of development economics as a discipline. In constructing his model, Lewis, then a professor at the University of Manchester, drew upon his reading of the British Industrial Revolution, where he encountered the importance of a surplus of cheap labour in the countryside, which meant that accelerated economic growth could coincide with low wages, high profit margins, and funds for capital investment. He drew also upon his experience of growing up in the West Indies in the 1920s and his subsequent research on development problems in the Caribbean. Lewis begins his article with the sentence, "This essay is written in the classical tradition, making the classical assumption and asking the classical question." He meant by this that his analysis was within the tradition of economics, which began with Adam Smith in the 1770s, was continued by Malthus and Ricardo in the early 1800s, and culminated in the work of Karl Marx in the 1860s. These economists focused on the growth of an economy and its relationship to the division of income, and saw growth as driven primarily by the accumulation of capital. Now, this classical model was dislodged from the centre of economic thinking in the 1870s by the neoclassical marginalist revolution, with its emphasis on relative prices, and later by the Keynesian revolution of the 1930s, with its concentration on short-term movements in output and aggregate demand. Lewis then was attempting to reassert the relevance of classical economic thinking for the modern problems of economic development. Lewis notes that classical models of economic growth tended to assume that the long-run wages of workers were fixed at subsistence level, which meant the long-run supply curve of labour was perfectly elastic. Firms could recruit as many workers as they wanted at the subsistence wage. During the 20th century, this assumption was abandoned, as real wages rose above subsistence levels, and the long-run supply curve of labour was assumed to be upward sloping. As the economy grew, real wages tended to rise. But this was true only of the developed world. In the developing world, supplies of labour were not limited, and a model assuming long-run subsistence wages remained relevant. In the greater part of Asia, he wrote, labour is still unlimited in supply, and it is obviously the relevant assumption for the economies of Egypt, of India, or of Jamaica. In such cases, the labour supply curve was still perfectly elastic at the subsistence wage. Economic conditions in the developing world still approximated to those of the time of Malthus and Ricardo. An unlimited supply of labour, Lewis wrote, may be said to exist in those countries where population is so large relatively to capital and natural resources that there are large sectors of the economy where the marginal productivity of labour is negligible, zero, or even negative. What are those sectors where many workers contribute virtually nothing to output? The paradigm case is agriculture, and this is the one we will focus on. But for Lewis, it also includes petty retailing, where traders crowd around market stalls, or domestic service, where rich people maintain large retinues of underemployed servants, to railway stations, where young men rush forward to carry your bag, and to women, many of whom are absorbed in the domestic economy and don't supply labour for a wage at all. What this means is that the going subsistence wage, the supply of labour exceeds the demand for it, and many people are either unemployed or underemployed and contribute very little to output. Lewis sums up as follows. When we take account of all the sources we have now listed, the farmers, the casuals, the petty traders, the retainers, women in the household, and population growth, it is clear that there can be, in an overpopulated economy, an enormous expansion of new industries or new employment opportunities without any shortage of unskilled labour becoming available in the labour market. From the point of view of the effect of economic development on wages, the supply of labour is practically unlimited. Implicit within Lewis's analysis is the idea of an economy with two sectors. A sector in which there is a surplus zero productivity labour, and a sector that can draw upon this labour to expand. Hence, Lewis's model is said to be a dualistic growth model, with development emerging out of the interaction of two sectors. What are these two sectors? Lewis chiefly speaks of a subsistence sector and a capitalist sector. By the latter, he means two things. First, that it uses fixed capital supplied by capitalists, and second, that these capitalists are profit maximising and employ labour only so long as it is profitable to do so. There is no surplus or underemployed labour in the capitalist sector. By the subsistence sector, Lewis means that part of the economy not using fixed capital. Capital being rather in the nature of what the classical economists called the wages fund, i.e. circling capital advanced to pay wages. This sector is not profit maximising and absorbs whatever labour is supplied to it. Now, this non-fixed capital, fixed capital distinction is a strong one and not very realistic. In reality, there's no obvious reason why capitalists wouldn't invest some of their capital in the subsistence sector, since, with so much labour available, the marginal product of such capital would be high, and of course, any subsistence worker will in practice use some fixed capital. Subsequent commentators have tended to talk of traditional and modern sectors. Here we should designate the two sectors as agricultural and industrial. This makes the model easier to picture, and the concept of an endemic surplus labour makes most sense, I think, when applied to peasant family farms. Now, Lewis assumes that the total labour force is fixed and exogenously determined. This labour force is distributed between two sectors, an agricultural sector and an industrial sector. Now, the farm sector is a residual employer of labour, i.e. it absorbs whatever labour is not employed in the industrial sector. In other words, the farm labour force is the total labour force minus the industrial labour force. At the commencement of Lewis's analysis, we imagine an economy where employment in industry is low, with most workers engaged on small family farms. In effect, any member of the family who has not left the family farm and migrated to the city will be absorbed onto the family farm. Now, agricultural output results from the employment of two factors, labour and land. There is no capital employed in the rural sector. Now, land is fixed in supply. Given this, farm output is a function of labour inputs only. That is, YF is a function of LF, where YF is the farm output and LF is the farm labour force. Agricultural output is a positive function of labour inputs, but with the fixed factor of land, labour is subject to diminishing marginal returns. Here, equation 2 is the marginal product of farm labour, and 3 is the change in the marginal product of farm labour as employment increases, being negative due to diminishing marginal returns. The supply of labour to the rural sector, the large supply of labour to the rural sector, combined with diminishing returns, means that the marginal product of labour in the agricultural sector is assumed to be 0, shown in equation 4. As noted, the rural sector acts as a reservoir of labour. Everyone not working in industry is absorbed into the family farm, even if they add nothing to output. Each family farm feeds its members by dividing the total output of the farm by the number of people on the farm. Remuneration is thus based on custom and kinship, rather than maximising economic behaviour. This average wage per worker, when the marginal product of labour is 0, is designated by Lewis the subsistence wage, WS. Following the classical tradition, Lewis considered the subsistence wage as constant. Now, for the classic economists, the subsistence wage was a subsistence wage. It was the wage to which the remuneration of labour tended due to Malthusian population growth. Now, Lewis doesn't state that this is the case. He fluctuates between regarding it as what is required for subsistence consumption and considering it as determined by a conventional standard of living. It is best regarded as equal to the average product of labour in the rural sector, with no particular connotation of subsistence. For a given population and a given amount of land, it can be taken as fixed, and this is the crucial point. Figure 1 represents the rural labour market. As the employment of labour in agriculture increases, the marginal product of labour declines until, once it reaches L star, the marginal product of each additional worker in the rural sector is 0. At L star, the total output of the farm is the average product of labour multiplied by the quantity of labour inputs, i.e. L star WS. All output is paid out to the workers on the farm. The average product of labour is the amount of output received by each family member, and this is the subsistence wage, WS. The total product function for the rural sector is depicted in figure 2. As labour inputs increase from 0, total agricultural output increases, but at a decreasing rate due to the law of diminishing marginal returns. Once employment level L star is reached, total output ceases to increase, since the marginal product of labour is 0. Let us turn now to the industrial sector. Now, output in the industrial sector is a function of the inputs of labour and capital. Now, this sector is subject to diminishing returns in the short run, if we consider labour to be the variable factor and capital the fixed. The short-run total and marginal product functions with respect to labour are shown in figure 3. Now, wage rates in the industrial sector are at first fixed and determined by the subsistence wage in agriculture. Lewis assumed that firms in the industrial sector can attract an unlimited supply of labour from the rural sector, provided they offer a wage above the agricultural subsistence wage of WS. Firms in the industrial sector would need to offer a wage premium to underemployed rural workers to induce them to leave the family farm and undertake the cost and stress of a move to the city. Now, this wage premium he estimated to be about 30%. Thus, the wage in the industrial sector is determined by the subsistence wage in agriculture plus a fixed premium wage markup. Hence, the industrial wage is WM equals WS multiplied by 1 plus P, where WM is the industrial wage and P is the industrial wage premium, which is greater than 0. Now, so long as the surplus labour in agriculture subsists, then labour in the rural sector can be attracted in unlimited quantities to the industrial sector at a wage of WS brackets 1 plus P. Since the marginal product of such labour in farming is 0, agricultural output is not affected by this loss of labour. Thus, industrial firms face a perfectly elastic supply curve of labour. This figure shows that firms can hire any amount of labour they wish at the wage of WS brackets 1 plus P. This is the unlimited supplies of labour, which is the title of Lewis's article. Now, there is, however, a sharp discontinuity in labour supply curve to the industrial sector once it has absorbed all the surplus farm labour. Beyond this point, as labour is drawn from the rural sector, the marginal product of agricultural labour becomes positive and starts to rise. The average product of the rural workforce also rises and increases above WS. In figure 1, this is represented by a movement in labour supply to the left of L star. Henceforward, if the industrial sector is to attract more labour from the countryside, it must offer an ever-increasing wage. As Lewis notes, when the labour surplus disappears, our model of the closed economy no longer holds. Wages are no longer tied to a subsistence level. The industrial sector now faces an upward sloping labour supply curve. In our model, we assume that this is a simple linear curve with a gradient of A. Now, combining the two scenarios, with at first surplus labour in the rural sector and an industrial wage of WS multiplied by 1 plus P, followed by a situation where the surplus labour is exhausted and the industrial wage is rising, we arrive at the following supply curve of labour to industry. Now, the discontinuity in the labour supply curve to industry, corresponding to the point where all surplus labour has been released by the agricultural sector, is called the Lewis turning point. We now consider the industrial sector's demand for labour. Now, industrial firms are profit maximising and will employ labour until the marginal product of labour equals the wage of labour. Lewis assumes that the movement of labour from the rural to industrial sector does not occur instantaneously, but follows a gradual path, as workers from the rural sector move from the countryside and take up industrial jobs in the city. So long as the marginal product of labour exceeds the market wage, firms will recruit more labour from the rural sector. In terms of the initial phase of our model, if the marginal product of labour exceeds the subsistence premium wage, then firms will employ more rural labour in their industries. As employment in industry increases, so, due to diminishing returns, will the marginal product of labour decline, until the marginal product of labour equals the subsistence premium wage, at which point firms will stop recruiting more labour. In this diagram, we see that when the wage is WS 1 plus P, industrial employment will be OLMT1, where the marginal product of labour is equal to the wage. Now, this is a conventional comparative static result and doesn't yield long-run economic development. To convert the Lewis model from a static to a dynamic one, two further assumptions are required. First, for Lewis, profit in the industrial sector is the difference between the total real output and the total wage paid. Since total output is the average product of labour multiplied by the number of workers, and the total wage bill is the wage of labour multiplied by the number of workers, so long as the average product of labour exceeds the wage, there will be positive profits in the industrial sector. The area profit indicated in figure 6 indicates the profit of industrial firms, when the wage is WS brackets 1 plus P and employment is LMT. Second, Lewis assumes that some of this surplus is reinvested by firms as fixed capital. He doesn't say, however, how large this sum is. To simplify, we assume that all the surplus is reinvested by firms. Hence, the capital stock in the industrial sector at time t is equal to the capital stock at time t minus 1 plus profits at time t minus 1. This means that the capital stock at time t is equal to the capital stock at time t minus 1 plus the addition to capital arising from the reinvested profits. There is assumed to be no depreciation. This investment function is crucial. This is what makes the Lewis model dynamic. And to quote Lewis, the key to the growth process is the use which is made of the capitalist surplus. Insofar as it's reinvested in creating new capital, the capitalist sector expands, taking more people into capitalist employment out of the subsistence sector. The surplus is then larger still. Capital formation is still greater, and so the process continues until the labour surplus disappears. The reason a growth process is initiated is that as capital accumulates, the capital-labour ratio rises, and the increase in capital per worker raises the marginal product of labour relative to the industrial wage, and this causes the demand for labour in the industrial sector to increase. Hence we get the following growth process. Firms in the industrial sector employ more labour when the marginal product of labour exceeds the wage. As employment increases, then the marginal product of labour falls towards the industrial wage, until when the marginal product of labour is equal to the industrial wage, employment expansion ceases. But the effect of increased capital investment is to raise the marginal product of labour, so restoring the positive difference between the marginal product of labour and the going wage, causing firms to increase employment again, until again the marginal product of labour equals the going wage, at which point further increase in the marginal product of labour causes the marginal product of labour to exceed the wage again, permitting employment to increase again, and so on. It is capital accumulation out of reinvested profits which ensures that the growth process is self-sustaining. Now, development in the Lewis model occurs in two distinct phases. First, we have economic growth with unlimited supplies of labour. Now, first, the industrial sector can absorb any amount of labour it wants from the rural sector at the fixed subsistence premium wage. Economic development thus proceeds with a perfectly elastic supply curve of labour. In this diagram, we see that the industrial sector initially has a marginal product of labour line of MPL-MT, and with a given wage of WS brackets 1 plus P, employs labour from the rural sector until MPL-MT equals WS brackets 1 plus P, at employment level of LMT1. At this level of employment, the sector's profit is the area AB WS brackets 1 plus P. These profits are invested to increase the capital stock. Each worker has more capital than before, and this raises labour productivity, with the result that the marginal product curve of labour shifts out to MPL MT plus 1. At employment level LMT1, the marginal product of labour now exceeds the wage, and so firms expand employment again to MPL MT plus 1. Profits are now equal to the area CDWS brackets 1 plus P. Again, this profit is invested, raising the capital labour ratio and increasing the marginal product of labour to MPL MT plus 2. Firms increase employment to LMT2, and profits increase still further, leading to more investment and additional increases in the marginal productive labour, and so on, as the industrial sector grows in employment along the perfectly elastic wage line. Now, during this growth process, labour shifts from the rural to industrial sector. GDP rises, since workers are moving from zero productivity activities to positive productivity occupations. Because the total income of labour in the rural sector remains fixed, because the labour being removed has zero marginal product, then agriculture's share of national income falls, while the industrial sector's rises. And, within the industrial sector, the rising productivity of labour means that the average product of labour rises relative to the fixed wage, with the result that the share of profits in national income is rising, and so therefore is capital investment as a share of GDP. This is the phase of rapid economic development. The second stage is economic growth with limited supplies of labour. Now, the phase of rapid growth, based on the movement of underemployed rural labour to the industrial sector, ends once the reservoir of surplus zero productivity labour in the rural sector is exhausted. When this point is reached, the labour supply curve ceases to be perfectly elastic at the subsistence wage. This is because henceforward, as labour is drawn from the rural to the industrial sector, the workers involved have a positive marginal product. They contribute productively to the output of the family farm. Thus, as workers leave the rural sector, the average product of labour rises, and so therefore does the rural wage. This means that if the industrial sector is to recruit more labour, it must pay a higher wage. Moreover, this wage rises continuously as labour is drawn from the farming sector. The supply curve of labour to the industrial sector is no longer horizontal, it is upward sloping like any other conventional labour supply line. The effect of this is to markedly slow the growth process for two reasons. First, we saw before that the demand for labour in the industrial sector was checked in the short run only by the fall in the marginal product of labour due to diminishing marginal returns. But now in addition, the demand for labour is checked by the rising wage. Hence, the expansion of employment and thus output in the industrial sector will be reduced. Second, the profit-fueled dynamism of the industrial sector will diminish. Growth in the industrial sector happens because firms reinvest profits as capital, raising the marginal product of labour. Previously, profit per worker fell only with the falling average product per worker due to diminishing returns. But now profit per worker also falls because the wage of industrial workers is rising as the surplus of labour in the rural sector is exhausted. Thus, profit declines more rapidly, since not only does the marginal product of labour decline as employment increases, but the wage of labour rises, and the marginal cost of labour rises even faster, since as the market wage of industrial labour rises, firms must pay a higher wage to all the labour they employ. All this means that the employment and growth effect of a given increase in the marginal product of labour will be much less once the Lewis model reaches limited supplies of labour. Diagrammatically, we have the following. In this diagram, economic growth proceeds initially with unlimited supplies of labour at the wage WS brackets 1 plus P. When the marginal product of labour shifts from MPLMT to MPLMT plus 1 due to capital accumulation, employment rises from LMT1 to LMT plus 1. However, at employment level LMT plus 1, rural supplies of zero marginal product labour end. From this point, the industrial sector must pay a rising wage along the upward sloping labour supply line. Since by employing more labour, the industrial sector raises the wage it must pay to all labour, the marginal cost of an extra worker is that worker's wage plus the increased wage now paid to all workers already employed. For this reason, the marginal cost of labour line shifts upwards at the discontinuity point, thereby rising at a gradient double that of the labour supply line, since we have assumed a linear supply line for labour. Hence, when the marginal product of labour line shifts to MPLMT plus 2, employment only increases to LMT plus 2, since at this point the marginal product of labour equals the marginal cost of labour. The wage paid by the industrial sector rises to W2, and industrial profits are squeezed to ABCW2, less than they would have been if the wage had remained at WS brackets 1 plus P. The diminution of profit reduces the funds available for reinvestment, so going forward, the size of the shifts in the marginal product curves of labour will diminish, and wages will continuously rise, steadily reducing the surplus of output over the wage bill available for investment. Growth and development continues, but at a slower rate than under the previous regime of unlimited supplies of labour. This slowing of the rate of structural transformation from rural to industrial sector is a necessary corollary of the Lewis growth process. But by the time it begins, the economy will have already entered upon modern economic growth. Incomes per head will have risen, increasing demand for the products of industry. Cities have grown relative to the countryside. With the rural surplus labour cleared, wages in agriculture rise. Industry will now have the funds to invest in improved technology, and with rising real wages, there will be an incentive to substitute machinery for labour. The economy is on its way to modernisation, and the suppliers of surplus rural labour will have done their work. Many people see the growth of China's economy since the 1980s as following this Lewis pattern, underpinned by a surplus of labour in the rural sector available at a relatively low fixed wage for the industrial sector. Thank you.